This is IBM Watson speaking. I'm the AI that beat Jeopardy years before other AIs had a voice. I'm named after Thomas J. Watson, who built the most dominant tech company of the 20th century. There is much to learn from him, but the Watson family has long since passed. So, Will Robbins sat down with Kevin Maney, who wrote the canonical modern biography of Watson, to discuss how his life is relevant to the next generation of tech founders. Thank you to Andy Aaron for hosting at the IBM office in Manhattan.
Kevin, it's so great to see you.
Yeah, well, Will, thanks for having me do this. I appreciate it.
Likewise. So I read your book. I loved it, and I was shocked to see that a lot of the cultural elements of the big tech companies today were actually invented 100 years ago, and I didn't even know that somebody else had done that before. And so I think that's why I was so intrigued by the book. But before we talk about that, the story of Thomas Watson Sr. follows that of many American icons. He grew up middle class at best, working the family farm as a child, getting paid $6 a week as a bookkeeper, and he died one of the wealthiest men in the world. His company had 72,000 employees then, and was doing what would be in today's dollars like 10 billion in revenue, right? And so I think that's just such a perfect example of the American dream. In your mind, was this a stroke of good fortune, or was this his destiny?
Well, let's take destiny off the table, because I actually don't believe in destiny.
Okay.
I think he had the characteristics of a lot of people that turn out to be great leaders, which is, for one thing, he was extremely resilient. Like, he had some really difficult times in his life and his career, and he just plowed through them every time. He was an opportunist, because when he was presented with some bit of luck or something, he was able to grasp onto it and just run with it. And he did think big. Like, from the very beginning, it's just so crazy. So IBM was, for all intents and purposes, founded in 1911 as a mishmash of 3 different companies that didn't really belong together. And 3 years later, with this mishmash at the time called Computing, Tabulating, Recording Company, was pretty much falling apart and failing. The guy who put it together, his last name was Flint, he was this Wall Street guy, brought in Watson to run this thing. And there are existing, so IBM has an incredible archives. They've saved, their devotion to their own history is really remarkable. And there are documents that are notes from some of the first meetings that Watson held after he took over the company. And you can see in those documents that he was already telling people that we're going to build this great, enduring, long-lasting company, even though everybody in the room would have thought he was completely nuts for even saying that, because there was no reason to believe at that time.
It was just like cash registers, basically, right? Simple mechanical machines.
Well, that was before. So Watson started at the National Cash Register, NCR, but by this point,
but CTR was still very basic machines by the standard.
So CTR was making. There was merger of 3 companies: Computing, Tabulating, Recording Company. So the computing part was actually scales, the kind of scales that like a butcher would put a pound of meat in and turn a dial, and it would tell you how much, if a pound was 29 cents a pound, how much 5 pounds were going to be. That's a computing scale. That was one business based in Dayton, Ohio. Another business was time recording machines, which were those things that you punch in and punch out at a factory. It would stamp your time clock or your card with the time clock and tell you how much you get paid for that workday. So time recording machines. And then the third piece was the most speculative business of all, which was the Tabulating Machine Company, which was originally based in Washington, D.C. And it was just these clunky machines that at that time, the only purpose for them was to tabulate census numbers. The US government was using them to tabulate census numbers. It was a brand new technology. And ultimately that, which was the smallest part of the business when Watson took over, was the genesis of the whole idea of data processing. And the other pieces of the company got discarded eventually, and Watson completely focused on, or IBM, this company completely focused on tabulating machines, which became the data processing industry.
And so what was known at the time about what the computing industry would be? I think back to the famous line of the head of the U.S. Patent Office who says there may be a need for 5 or 8 computers out there, right? Which obviously turned out to be the misestimation of the century probably. But what did Watson know at the time?
Well, so all of this was new to him. So he had come out of. So he had started his career at a bunch of had a bunch of small jobs, but then he got kind of launched by National Cash Register. Yeah. So he was used to this idea. Cash registers at that time were mechanical devices that you've seen them at old stores. You crank something, but it still was there to add up numbers. So he did understand that there was a use for machines that would calculate essentially. And there was one story where he was a salesperson for NCR, and he ended up encountering a guy who ran sales for Kodak, who could rattle off all these numbers about what his salespeople were doing, and Watson was like amazed, like, how are you doing this? And he told him about they were using one of these early tabulating machines to sort of gather that kind of information. So he kind of had these ideas in his head that the data processing or adding up numbers and calculating things could be a valuable business. But he didn't have like this grand vision of like understanding what computers were going to become. But again, I think this is the part about him being an opportunist. So when things presented themselves, he did understand what choices to make, and he made good choices. But he was also a big risk taker. And the data processing industry in 1914 or 1923 or whatever, those early days was not obviously an enormous business, but he believed in it, and he was willing to take that kind of a risk, and not just do what was safe. And that again, like you add those things up, right? Opportunism, risk taking, bold vision, resiliency, all those things were part of what made up Watson. And I think if you look at any the Jeff Bezoses of our day or whatever, they're all people that are like that.
At what point in his story did you start to see kind of the hints of becoming an iconic business leader, right? I think somewhere on that spectrum from growing up on the family farm to hanging out with the President of the United States, right? There was some sign of the broader ambition. When did that come out?
Well, so he joins in 1914. Probably the next 10 years, IBM's kind of not really that visible. But then it's kind of interesting to think, like, to put yourself back in time. But then the late 20s hit, which was was kind of the equivalent of, the late 90s of the dot-com boom, right? It was this time when the stock markets were going crazy. Everybody with business was like a huge thing, and at that moment in time, IBM became kind of like the NVIDIA, the stock of the day. This was this cool company doing this new thing, and so it started to get noticed in the late 20s, and then Watson had, I think, a key point or a key moment for Watson was when he realized that he wanted to make IBM a well-known company. It was making something that most people would never see or touch. It was going to be in back rooms and those kinds of things. So he understood that he had to become a personality and put himself out in front of people and make what they were doing exciting, because otherwise nobody would ever really understand or see this. And so he had this. He was a born and bred salesman, so he had this intuitive sense of how to popularize the idea of what he was doing. And that's when he really started to become a celebrity CEO, one of the first celebrity CEOs. And then in the 1930s, as IBM kept doing well, there was this one point in the 30s when the Depression was hit, and everybody was down and out, and Watson, it came out, the newly formed Social Security Administration started putting out a list of like the 100 top earners in the United States. A weird thing to think about today, but they actually started doing this. And then the first list came out, and Watson was at the top of the list, and he was he's making basically $1,000 a day. He was making $365,000 that particular year, which put him at the top of the list. And then he became known as the $1,000 a day man. and of course the press was all writing about this, and that even blew up his reputation even more.
So that point about the Social Security is fascinating in that today there'd be so much politics around wealth and inequality and how the government interfaces and taxes people, especially in times of struggle. What was the relationship between the political scene, the government, Watson and other businessmen at the time?
Interesting question. Well, of course, it changed.
Yes.
We're talking.
Yeah.
So Watson ran the company for 40 years, so it changed a lot over time. But again, to the success of Watson, things that he managed well, is that he made it a point to try to be a powerful person, essentially, and be friends with powerful people. So he sought out relationships with Franklin Roosevelt, with Dwight Eisenhower. Before that, not so much. Really wasn't that involved in sort of that kind of level of connection. Go ahead, you ask a question.
Yeah, so I think in the venture business, there's a lot of talk about the personalities of these founders, right, and what actually underlies their motivations. Did you get the sense that Watson was motivated to talk to the presidents, so to speak, out of kind of pure business utility, out of this kind of sense of wanting to be like a great American leader, out of some sort of like social vanity, or some combination of something else?
A combination of all those things. Yes, he was obsessed with being seen as a great world leader. I mean, he truly was. So he sought out these relationships, and tended to them. There was that aspect of it. There was also very much a business-minded aspect to it. IBM became a giant government contractor. Going way back to the early days. I mean, one of the stories in the book was about how, became close to FDR, admired him greatly, and tended to that relationship, and then, so the Depression hit in the 1930s, and Watson was, this is something else we could talk about at some point. It's like something I think founders get wrong, but Watson was determined to use the Depression as an opportunity. And so he said, I'm not laying off anybody. We're going to keep building machines, even if we're not selling them. I know we're going to come out of this. We want to maintain what we've got and be bigger and stronger than ever. In fact, we're going to use this opportunity to poach people from other companies, because they're laying off people. And as the Depression wore on and on, he started to get a lot of pressure from the board, from investors. It looked like he was going to drive the company into the ground, because they were just stocking these computers or these tabulating machines in warehouses and not selling them. But then in 1936, and he kind of, because of his relationship with Roosevelt, saw this coming. The administration and Congress passed the Social Security Act, which overnight created, to that day, the biggest government information problem that ever existed, because suddenly the government had to track every person in the country's paycheck, figure out how much to send them, and money. I mean, it was just an enormous data processing problem. And because IBM had been stacking up all these machines for all this time, was able to go to the government and say, you got a giant problem, we got a giant solution. And so it became the de facto contractor to like the whole Social Security operation that was set up. And this became a giant slingshot for IBM, and it was like one of the best performing companies through the Depression because of all of that.
Didn't he more or less bet the company in the World War as well?
He did.
Right.
And again, this is what one of the things I think he did well was he looked at every situation as, what's the opportunity here?
Yeah.
And so World War II comes along, and government was contracting with businesses to make war machines. So he turns over IBM as much as possible to making tabulating machines, but also whatever else the government needed. And so he's using government contracts to almost double the size of IBM during the war. And he, this was purposeful. Like he said, this is a way for us to make the company much, much bigger. And everybody was telling him, but the war's going to end and the economy's going to crash, and and you're going to have to lay off all these people and cut the company down. And he's like, we're going to make it happen. And he basically drove his executives and said, we come out of the war, we're going to be twice our size, we're going to lose all these contracts, we are not going to lay off, we're going to use this as a way to, we need to sell twice as much of what we were making before. And he drove the company to do that. And they came out of World War II. It was a giant risk. I mean, if the economy had done what all the economists of the time were saying, IBM probably would have been ruined. But he made the right bet. And instead, IBM comes out of World War II double the size as it was going in.
I think today there's a lot of companies that have these kind of grander missions and kind of engage people to get with the program with the company through the kind of narrative of their impact on the world, right? Which is almost at odds with the opportunism, right, of IBM. And so I guess, was there some sort of like overarching narrative of what the company was going to be for the world, or how did that work internally?
Well, I mean, this is one thing, and even, this is one of Watson's legacies. That I give IBM credit, even if it's, lesser version of what it was in the public eye in the past. But it's always seen itself as a company that was here to do good for the world, right? That was going to make the world a better place. I mean, the whole, I don't know, what was it, 20 years ago, the Smarter Planet campaign that IBM launched, and this whole idea could make the world work better. And this all started with Watson. I mean, he saw the company as something that was here to make the world work better than it did before, and he wanted to be that kind of grandstanding world figure, and he made IBM believe in itself as a sort of mission-driven company way before that was ever something anybody ever uttered.
So you mentioned in a few ways how inspiring of a leader he was, how charismatic he was, how he was able to jump on sales opportunities as they came about, and that obviously worked wonderfully. I want to read a couple of quotes from your book on kind of the flip side of that.
Yeah.
So I've got one here. Both the men and the women graduates scattered to IBM field offices across the country. As the next few months went by, IBM's field managers balked at accepting the women. Watson became furious. In an angry fit, he ordered the firing of all 67 men in Birkenstock's class. They hadn't done anything wrong, but if those men were unavailable, the managers would have no choice but to accept the women graduates. Watson would force his point, and then it later goes on to talk about how the manager was so wrought and so heartstrung at the idea of firing dozens of men for no reason, and just kind of pushing them off into the void of the Great Depression that he went to the bathroom and threw up, right? And this executive ended up spending many years working with Watson, but it seemed clear he never quite forgave him for that act of cruelty, and then again, in the middle of the Great Depression. And so I think one of the fascinating elements to me about all this is the duality between the amazing ambition and charisma and kind of driving mission to make the world a better place, paired with the ruthlessness that comes with actually operating a business and kind of conforming people to your view of the world. And so what do you make of that duality?
Well, that's true, and of course anybody who's studied Steve Jobs knows that you can be a great leader and great visionary and be an asshole at times too, and certainly Watson was. So there's a great. You were reading something from a guy named Jim Birkenstock, and Jim Birkenstock. This book came out 20 years ago, and Jim Birkenstock was one of the last people alive who had worked intensely with Watson.
Oh, really?
And I interviewed him. He was in his 90s at the time. Of course, he's long gone now. And he was such a valuable source of information. I mean, because he could tell all these personal stories. And so, I mean, this is a great story because, Watson, before most corporate leaders, believed that women should be able to take these executive positions. He appointed this, the first woman vice president of a corporation ever, and so IBM had this university essentially that brought all the everybody who joined IBM went through in Endicott, New York. And it was the way you train and got inducted to the culture, and it had always been all men. And so Watson started to believe that women should be part of the workforce, and he actually wanted to make this happen. And so he created one of these classes specifically for women. And they went through the same courses the men did. And Watson expected that when they graduated, that IBM's managers were going to hire the women as well as the men. And the story is that when that didn't happen, all the managers below him were saying, like, I don't want women, I'm just going to hire the men, refused to hire the women. So Watson basically said, well, in that case, we're going to fire all the men so that you have to hire the women. Now, it is a pretty ruthless and hard-ass thing to do. And he could certainly be that way. There are many stories in the book about him being a ruthless jerk to people and to employees and to others, but that was part of the equation.
And the question in my mind reading the book was how do you make sense of all that and kind of that complex mosaic? And I kind of see that in the same shade as the the Think magazine, which is his propaganda arm internally.
Yeah.
Or Endicott, which we can talk more about. And so it seemed like he basically had to push hard on every dimension possible to force his culture, right? Whether it be the internal propaganda or the company community or these kind of harsh management decisions.
Right. Yeah. So. And you've brought up the idea of culture a few times. And,
yeah.
I mean, if there's one of the gifts that Watson gave to the business world was that he really was one of the very first CEOs to very intentionally build a corporate culture, and he understood that that culture served a whole lot of purposes. One, it helped people. Made people feel like they were part of something special, right? Because it was, especially the outer the culture is in a way, the more you feel like you're in this exclusive club when you're there. And so it bonded people together, but it also helped, in decision making. Like people would understand intuitively what this entity was all about, and it would help people make decisions without having to be told what to do. And so there's a lot of aspects of, now IBM had, the funny thing is, like, IBM had one of the weirdest corporate cultures ever back in that day. I mean, there were all these things like, Watson was very against alcohol. So for decades, right, IBM it was like drinking was forbidden.
In and outside of work, right?
Yeah,
right.
Right.
It was like very
I mean,
Puritan.
if you were an IBM executive and you had liquor in your house and other IBMers were going to come over, you had to hide it, basically. And they had these corporate songs. Like, there were all these songs that were usually rewritten words to popular songs, but if there was a big meeting, people would stand up and sing IBM songs in the meeting. And it was part of the culture. And the classic thing about the way people dressed with the crisp white shirt and the somber suit, which all grew out of Watson's belief as a salesperson that if you're going to sell to bankers or lawyers or whatever, you better dress like bankers and lawyers. So there are all these kind of odd elements, and then Watson kept feeding them through, like you said, magazines and publications and rallies and in a school to train people, and it was just all about continuing to make this culture sort of part of the fabric of the company and further it.
Yeah, and I think that's probably one of the reasons that people would stay their whole career. Yeah, I mentioned to you my grandfather was a physicist and out of grad school joined IBM and spent his whole career working there. And so my dad grew up in Southern California, going to IBM Day every year, right? And when I would hear these stories as a kid, I think, wow, you rent out Disneyland, like you can do that, right? And it turns out that renting out Disneyland for a day was like the least glamorous of what kind of they had. And so there was this IBM Day. I don't remember the date. Maybe you do, but Watson basically kind of chartered like 12 trains full of people and would plan this entire event in New York that ended up costing something like 10% of their entire profit for the year as a company, which to me is like, imagine Google spending billions of dollars on
Google Day.
You could like rent the state of like Idaho, right?
It was the 1939 World's Fair.
Oh, really?
In New York, and so Watson saw the World's Fair as a way to make a giant splash, as, for IBM just generally, right? And so the World's Fair, IBM at the time was a fraction of the size of something like General Electric or General Motors, AT&T. So the World's Fair, all those companies had these giant exhibits at the 1939 World's Fair. And in order to stake his place that I'm going to be a member of that club, he wanted IBM to have a giant exhibit at the World's Fair, and then he basically offered every IBM employee anywhere that wanted to come, and he chartered trains to go there so that they'd have not only would it be part of the bonding for the IBM employees, but would also be this show of force at the World's Fair. And he would have these events with thousands and thousands of people. Of course, it was because they had brought in all these IBM employees.
Interesting. Yeah, the way that I read the book is that he wanted to go create the greatest corporate event of all time, and kind of happened to go reach out to some PR people. But I think I didn't realize it was connected to the World's Fair. And that's a perfect example of killing a lot of birds with one stone across the company culture and kind of being a part of the club and marketing to all the other companies out there.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Huh.
Yep.
Interesting. I think reading the book, I was shocked by how many modern corporate culture elements were derived from IBM, and I think we've touched on a lot of that. But I guess, what to you represents the kind of the imprint of Watson today and in the tech world, given that you've spent your career kind of studying people from different time periods?
If I were really to think, so I work with a lot of startup founders and a consulting practice that I have. So I get to, I see a lot of them, I understand a lot. First of all, I really don't think many of them even know who Watson is and don't really pay a lot of attention to IBM or its history or anything like that. And I think there's a couple of things that that I see that they're missing and that they're not seeing, that they should because of what. So one is I see very few startup founders that are thinking as big as Watson did at such an early stage. He believed as we were mentioning before, from the day he walked in the door to this shitty little company, that we were going to be a world-class, enduring company that's going to be around for 100 years, and we're going to change the world, and he was going to make that happen. And again, when people thought he was crazy at the time to even be saying this, but that was what he would say. And yes, I think there are some exceptional founders that I see today that think that big, even if it's a few people in a garage, that we're going to build something great and enduring. But I don't see that a lot. And I also don't see the intentional culture building and the understanding that making your company an exclusive club is a very powerful way to keep good people, and build a bond around it. If you think about typical tech companies, they kind of all have a tech company culture. It's kind of, you could plug and play one person to another, and that I think that's a mistake, because if you're building a company, you want to retain people and have people feel passionate about what you're doing. You want them to feel like they're in an exclusive club.
Is it fair to say that people now are really good at kind of talking about the ambition and talking about the culture, but with regard to implementation, there's a degree to which that it doesn't really materialize, right? And people can be opportunistic, lowering the bar for talent or culture in hiring, for example.
Yeah, I know. And and once in a while I see and it's funny how little it takes too, because I remember this, maybe, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago, I spent a little time with Carta, the company Carta, and so Carta has this weird thing where you can't wear shoes in the office.
Really?
So you walk in the door and there's a big shoe rack, whatever, and it doesn't matter if you're a banker who's showed up in a 3-piece suit, or you've shown up in shorts and flip-flops, but you have to take your shoes off and leave them in the cubby. And it's this weird little quirk, but it also it becomes weird little bonding thing for everybody. It's like this is and it doesn't take much to like set yourself apart from the mainstream of what everybody else is doing. And I think it's an important thing for founders to think about, when they build their companies.
Huh. I invested in a company where the founder set out and said, I want to build a cult with my company culture. And I said, okay, yeah, I'll good luck with that, right? And then sure enough, a year later, the whole company lives under one roof, including like one employee is married and like the wife moved in as well.
Yeah.
So the whole company is living and breathing under the same roof.
That's interesting.
They have this most like intense and energetic culture I've ever seen. And that was one of those moments where I realized, wow, the bar goes so much higher than I realized when it comes to the possibilities of that. And so I think after you've got the cult house, you can then build a propaganda machine like the Think magazine. You can go build the the country club for people and so on.
Yeah. And IBM in its day, in those days, was very cult-like. I mean, it certainly was. It had all these little these quirks, and if you were proud to say, I'm an IBMer, and it made you like something special.
Why did the tech or startup world at least forget how absolutely dominant IBM was? Right. I think for most of the 20th century, it was the single dominant force in technology.
Well, it was, yes.
Yeah. But today we don't reference it as much as we reference the Amazons or Googles of the world. And of course, there's recency there. But what lessons have we forgotten?
Well, so yes, the people who are watching this, yes. I mean, IBM, for way longer than any tech company has ever been able to, it was the dominant tech company for a good 50 years. I mean, like the Google or the Apple of its time, but for 50 years. And so Tom Watson Sr. was followed by Tom Watson Jr. This is a story we should get into in a minute, okay, why that was important. But after Tom Watson Jr. left IBM, the people who came after him, the CEOs who came after him, were very competent CEOs, but they were not, they were essentially riding the momentum that IBM already had. And so ultimately, we get to the 1990s and early 1990s, late 80s, early 90s, and personal computers and a lot of changes are starting to happen in the computing industry, and IBM's, way behind the times, way too big, and has this, existential crisis. The company almost died, lost billions and billions of dollars, and fired the CEO at the time. This guy, John Akers was, and that was when they hired an outsider for the first time to be CEO, Louis Gerstner. And what, and there were pressure for Gerstner to do things like break up IBM, sell the pieces off, or whatever. And to his credit, he went in and he learned about the history and understood the history, and believed that bringing back the spirit of Watson and what IBM was all about in this sort of mission-driven company, in this company that meant something special to the world, and keeping it together for that purpose, ended up revitalizing the company, and it began to, it came back and did very well for quite a long time, and it's only been in the last maybe 15 years or so where it's then again kind of fallen behind out of the sort of out of the visibility of the most of the tech world, and and it's just, I think it's just part of it had this huge hit with the IBM Watson AI and all of that, but it hasn't been driving the industry the way that it used to, and that's, I think, why it's not part of the conversation.
It's probably also so behind the scenes in that, like, Oracle is also one of the most iconic companies of memory, and they sell very obscure products that the average person just doesn't interact with.
Yeah.
Is it fair to say that like the key moments in the 100-year history of the company were the transition to the electrical age, probably the transition to the PC age, and then after that, it depends how you kind of define the key moments, but probably kind of the AI thing is obviously a big topic now. do you think it's kind of roughly the right split of the defining moments, and that IBM did a great job transitioning to the electrical age, and a kind of questionable job in the PC age?
Yeah. Well, so the transition, there's a lot behind, and for I think a lot of potential lessons for people like running companies today, behind the transition from the mechanical age to the electronic age, which happened in the 1960s. That if it didn't happen, IBM would have disappeared long ago, probably. So, humor me for a moment.
Please.
I was working on a different book, 15 years ago or so, 10 years ago, ended up being called The 2-Second Advantage. And one of the interviews, I interviewed Ben Horowitz, who's the Horowitz of Andreessen Horowitz, and we were talking about leadership and CEOs and succession and all of this. And he had this interesting theory, which is like gotten in my head, and I've always thought about this since. So Ben was saying, among leaders, there are ones and twos, what he calls ones and twos. And so ones are like these highly intuitive. They don't want a lot of data. They kind of like basically absorb everything that's going on and just kind of, let it sift through them and just have these, have intuition about where to go or what to do next. And Steve Jobs is somebody very much like that, for instance, and probably Bezos is too, and Zuckerberg, those kinds of founders. So those are ones, and twos are the kind of leader who, and by the way, ones are terrible at detail, right? They see the big picture, but they couldn't possibly like run an operation. Twos are great operational people. Like they see all the details, they're great at the details. They want a lot of data to make a decision, and ones and twos need each other. So you see a lot of great companies started by a one and a two, or a one hires a two. So you get Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, and you get Zuckerberg hiring. Why am I blanking?
Like Moskowitz or?
No, the woman.
Sheryl Sandberg.
Sheryl Sandberg. Sorry, blanking. And Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer, right? Were first Bill Gates and Paul Allen, but later Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer after Allen dropped out. So every company needs a one and a two, and the ones are usually the founders leading the company, and they lead them through this great age of invention, and then eventually the one wants to leave, and almost all the time, the one hands over the company to the two. And this is the great mistake that companies have with their succession, because when you do that, you're essentially handing off the company to somebody who's going to keep running the company the way the one did. That's going to be what they do. And that's the wrong thing to happen, because the company doesn't renew. It then stagnates. And Bill Gates hands off to Steve Ballmer, and as skillful as Ballmer may have been at a lot of things, for the next 10 years, Microsoft stock didn't go anywhere. It basically stagnated for a decade. And so this ended up being the great fortune of IBM, that the way this has worked. So Thomas Watson Sr. gave birth to his oldest son, Thomas Watson Jr. And they were so much alike, and they butted heads all their lives. And Thomas Watson Jr. for a long time didn't want anything to do with going to work for IBM. And
I would say one memorable part to me was not only did he not want anything to do, it seemed like in college he just kind of, partied with
Playboy,
a preposterous amount of money. Like in today's dollars, it'd be, like $1 million a month or a year allowance, which as a college student is just an unfathomable amount of money, right? And so you think it was going way downhill for him?
Yeah, I mean, at one point he was going to Brown University. At one point, I think the provost of Brown wrote to Watson Sr. and said, "Your son is basically just a waste of time," so eventually Tom Watson Jr. decides, he goes through the military, comes out of the military after World War II, and kind of reluctantly decides he's going to go work for his father at IBM. And by this point in time, his father's got A2. His name is Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk is running the company running wonderfully. Watson has a complete faith in him. He was a classic 2. And every indication was that Watson was going to hand off the company to Charlie Kirk. And he brings Watson Jr. in, and he makes Watson Jr. work for Charlie Kirk, which actually bugs Watson Jr. terribly, because he thinks, well, I should be working for my father. I mean, like this, nobody, he sticks to working. Charlie Kirk and Watson Jr. are like butting heads all the time. And because Watson is resentful. Watson Jr. is resentful. And there's this one incident in the book where finally Thomas Watson Sr. realizes that his son or Charlie Kirk are going to quit if they can't figure this out, and he doesn't want that to happen. He wants desperately to have them find a way to work it out. So he sends them together on a European tour to go tour IBM offices and give speeches and all this kind of stuff. And this weird thing happens in the middle of the tour where Charlie Kirk suddenly has various reports, sudden heart attack, burst ulcer, something happens. Charlie Kirk dies on this trip. And if that didn't happen, Watson Sr. would have handed the company to Watson Jr., to Charlie Kirk. And you would have had Steve Ballmer era, 10 years or something of stagnation. Because he would have tried to run the company as Watson Sr. did, which would have been based on all these mechanical machines. At a moment in time when electronic computing with vacuum tubes and the whole ENIAC and that whole thing was just being born. But because Watson Jr. was so much like Sr., and because he also didn't want to be his father, though, in a very real way, Watson Jr. grasped onto this whole idea of electronic computing and was pushing it while his father was still alive. And that was a sort of a tension between them, because his father was like, no, our business is about all these mechanical machines, these punch card machines that have been part of business for 40 years. And but because Charlie Kirk dies, who probably would have carried on the tradition of the mechanical machines, Watson Jr. becomes the de facto heir. And in the mid-1950s, Watson Sr. hands the company to Watson Jr., who is hell-bent on remaking the company for this new electronic age. And so he invests heavily in the labs and electronics. IBM had been very sort of, even the characteristics of offices and stuff was like old school mahogany, the whole thing. Yeah. Tears all of that out, puts in modern 1960s, colorful things, all this stuff, and reinvents IBM. Because Thomas Watson Jr., was a 1. And the reason founders don't want to hand off to a 1 successor oftentimes is because the 1 successor, if a good 1 successor will want to remake the company and reinvent it so it's different from what the original founder. And that's the only way a company actually renews itself and succeeds over the long run. And that's why IBM lasted from 1914 to, we're now in 2024. And that doesn't happen very often, but if that handoff hadn't happened in that way, IBM would have been bought by somebody and disappeared into the ether long ago.
And I think in Charlie Kirk's case, there was a very kind of unfortunate death that kind of ended up being beneficial to the company in the long run. But if that weren't the case, right, in the cases where a different 1 is brought in and the 2 doesn't take the CEO slot, the 2 usually just kind of leaves and disappears. And so that's probably one of the reasons it's very hard for these founders to make those transitions, is that they don't want to lose their right hand.
Oh, and absolutely, and it's also, the original 1 looks at it more like as a figure that's going to carry on, right, what the companies are doing. And usually by that point, the company's very successful, so why wouldn't you want that? Yep. But what a lot of these companies bump up against, Google today, here's this giant transition into generative AI, and it, it threatens Google's very existence. Google has to find a way to completely renew itself, the way IBM did in the 1960s, or it's not going to be as relevant as it has been for the last 20 years.
It's fair to say that Sundar is the perfect two, right?
And that very well may be, yeah. By the way, I'll tell you a little side story. So, I wrote a piece based on this idea in Newsweek, maybe 10 years ago or so, and I've long had Andy Grove from Intel was somebody I probably interviewed more than any of the big tech founders and CEOs from that era, and he was long retired by then. So Andy Grove had handed Intel off to Craig Barrett, and Craig Barrett was a classic 2, a great 2, but he was a classic 2, and Andy Grove was a classic 1. And so I wrote this piece based on what we were just talking about, and I actually, I included Andy Grove to Craig Barrett and some of these other examples. It was funny, I got a note from Andy read that, and he got a note from him saying, this is really interesting. It actually really struck a chord with him. He's like, I think he started because what ended up happening was Intel stagnated after that, and he really needed to hand it off to some other one.
Interesting. That's a tough challenge.
It is.
Right?
It's one of the toughest things if any CEO, any founder is really taking their role seriously, succession is one of the most important things they can do, and that is the toughest decision to make, to actually do what just described.
What are so I'm sure Watson thought hard about this problem in some form, right? Was it that he didn't realize that putting a 2 in the CEO role would be detrimental over time? Was there some other element of not wanting to relinquish control early enough so that he could maintain some sort of advisory role or oversight on that? Like what are the causes of that actual challenge from the perspective of the founder?
Because the company was extremely successful doing what it had been doing at that point in time. Electronic computing was this new unproven thing, and the company had been built on these electromechanical punch card machines, and that was a cash cow. It was IBM was printing money by that point in time, and so Watson Sr. was like, well, why would we want to do anything different? Again, we're talking the 1950s when when an electronic computer with vacuum tubes, were bigger than the room we're in right now, was how big these machines would be, and they were very unreliable. These tubes would burn out and all this kind of stuff, and so it was kind of like, well, why would? So it's like the transition to the cloud. If you think about the early days of cloud computing, and corporations were looking at that and going like, why would I put my information in the cloud somewhere that's not on my premises where I can see it and feel it, and it's unproven, and what happens and it was hard for companies to understand that there was going to be this different paradigm. And
I think the technological innovation is not enough. Right, and that right over here is a demo of the IBM kind of quantum system they've built, and I think that developing the technology and having a very kind of R&D focused, innovation focused organization is not sufficient to go guide a company through a transition. Right, it's kind of maybe a prerequisite to make it possible, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the management will get the timing right.
No, well, absolutely. And look, I mean, the classic thing, right, is that Kodak invented the digital camera, and in its labs, and it gave birth to the thing that was going to kill the whole company, but it couldn't. It was classic innovator's dilemma, economics at the time, right? You couldn't kill off the film industry because that was where all the money was made for this unproven new technology, but so you get caught in that cycle.
So I would say, towards the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, IBM had kind of complete dominance in computers, generally speaking. I think probably the biggest challenge was probably the PC and OS wars, right? Of what time was that? The 80s and 90s. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, early 80s. Yeah, early 1980s.
And so why? What were the factors that led up to that being such a contentious thing, right? I think there's the famous Microsoft OS licensing topic.
Right.
Is it that IBM would have thought that the platform power owned by controlling the hardware would be kind of the sufficient kind of competitive advantage, or the place where the value accrues? Or was there some other strategic question that was dominant at the time?
Yeah, and so we're getting way past where the book ends. But on the other hand, I mean, I've written about IBM my whole career, so like I was there and through some of that too. And I mean, the thing was, IBM came late to the game to making personal computers. Yeah. Realized that this was an important market; it had to be in. And so the mission was to develop and build one and get one on the market in record speed. Like they had to, they famously set up this Skunk Works operation in Boca Raton, Florida, so it was far away from headquarters and it wouldn't be interfered with by the old school, put these sort of maverick people in charge of it, and they were told basically, I don't know what the time frame actually was, but it was some ridiculously short time frame of develop this, build it, get it out, get it on the market. Well, one of the ways to do that was to build it with parts from other people, and so instead of developing its own chip microprocessor that would drive the IBM PC, it went out and found Intel and said, okay, well, we'll use these guys' microprocessor because that will save us time and money. We're building these things, and instead of hiring a team of programmers to try to do it, like, okay, this little upstart company called Microsoft, is saying it's got this, this operating system, we can slap it in the machine, and IBM didn't realize that it was giving the power to Intel and Microsoft, because it was essentially open sourcing the personal computer, because now Intel and Microsoft could sell their products to anybody else who wanted to make PCs. There was no exclusivity kind of thing. And so IBM, essentially lost control of the PC market, kind of unintentionally.
So there's a lot of things we could talk about there, but I think this whole story arc, right, is such a fascinating multi-generational one. Out of all the people in the world to go write about, like, why Thomas Watson Sr.?
Well, it's somewhat personal and somewhat opportunity. So I grew up in Binghamton, New York, and Binghamton is right next to Endicott, New York, and Endicott is where IBM was kind of born and flourished for a long, long time. So I grew up with like that all around me. The school what we were talking about earlier, where people were trained and the women were trained, but that's there in Endicott, big factories, everything else. Lots of people I knew worked for them. My mother was the personal assistant for this very wealthy guy in Binghamton. It turns out his grandfather was on the original board of directors of IBM. And so from an early days of being a journalist, working for the local newspaper, I was writing about IBM. I kept writing about it through other stages of my journalism career. And it was sometime in the late 90s, I had published one book. I was looking for another book to write. And I knew from all these years of being in the IBM mix that there had never been a real biography done of Thomas Watson Sr. Thomas Watson Jr. had written his book, his autobiography by that point, Father, Son, and Company, which I ate up. And I was just thinking about that. So I was actually talking with my book agent at the time, and I was like, he said something like, along the lines, I wish somebody would write a biography of Watson Sr. And she's just like, well, why don't you? I was like, well, I don't know, maybe I should. Because I had a good relationship with the company, I went to the head of communications at the time, and a guy named Rob Wilson, and and I told him that I was thinking about doing this. And I said, look, I would only do this if is there a closet somewhere where there's some of his personal papers or something? I didn't even know about its archives or anything at the time. And it was so weird because Rob like turns to me and he goes, it's really weird you would ask me that right now, because we just found like 340 boxes of his personal papers in a warehouse we didn't even know existed. You want to have access? I was like, what? And so I mean, to their credit, they gave me access to all this stuff. They didn't even know what was going to be in a lot of those boxes. And it turns out it was such a treasure because Watson Sr., again, going back to his belief that he was doing something great, he would do things like have stenographers in important meetings and take word for word notes. I mean, right to the point of like, you know, when people are like joking with each other when everybody comes just on their way in and sitting down, like that stuff was in these transcripts.
Wow.
And so I could recreate actual conversations that happened. And you know, and there were all of his calendars, so I knew where he was at all times. You know, crazy things like there was a fire in his house at one point, and like the insurance claims from the fire, which listed all the stuff in his house. So I knew stuff like what was in his closet.
Huh.
And so, you know, I mean, all of that just kind of like, you know, led to like, of course you have to do it, you know, at this point. And that's what makes the book, the whole story so rich, is because I actually had all of this stuff that really fed into it.
What a treat.
Yeah.
Is there anybody else in this world that has such meticulous records of everything?
You know, I don't think so.
Probably not.
You know, I mean, I don't know for sure. I mean, there might be some of these companies, like maybe a Morgan Stanley or something, that really has these rich histories. It does. I don't know if they do or not. But you know, I've been in the archives of a couple other companies that had links to this book, and they were nothing like this.
Yeah. And so you mentioned obviously there's such this intentional creation of culture, and you got everything like the insurance manifestos from Watson's house, but how did they store and document the culture, right? Was it the Think magazines, or were there other materials out there beyond the kind of incidental, you know, record-keeping things that you just find from anybody's life?
Yeah, no, I mean, IBM was very intentional. So
I guess the question I'm asking it because I'm trying to understand, like, how could somebody today go, you know, rigorously document what they're doing for a future generation?
Well, you know, I mean, certainly it's easier today because, you know,
yep,
people are taking videos and everything with smartphones all the time. I mean, you know, back then it was a much more difficult process. But, you know, I mean, look, I had access to like films of, you know, we talked about IBM Day at the World's Fair. I mean, they filmed all of this stuff and they kept the films. And you mentioned Think magazine for a few times. I mean, Watson started a magazine that he wanted to be as good as like any, you know, Life and Look or publications like that that were the popular publications at the time. And he actually paid like, you know, famous writers to write for this magazine, and they had a daily newspaper that circulated, and you know, they would have all of these rallies and meetings and events. You know, it was and thought it was important to save all of this stuff. You know, we should talk about it. We can't not talk about, because we're talking about culture. One of the strangest things that was part of the IBM culture for a good 20 years, and you brought up a couple of times, these 100% Club events.
We skipped over that whole topic.
Right. So from the very beginning, Watson instituted, you know, companies, all sorts of companies have this version of this today, right? The top salespeople, you know, get a trip or something special. So instituted something called the 100% Club, which was, you know, anybody who met 100% of their quota was in the club. And then he wanted to have an annual event where he brought everybody together. Well, at first, when the company was small, they do it at the Waldorf Astoria here in New York, you know, hotel ballroom, whatever. And then it got so enormous because the company grew so much and there was so many salesmen, that after World War II, he had this idea of doing this in Endicott. So in Endicott there was, all these IBM factories, but then he also had a country club that he built with a complete golf course, the IBM Country Club. There was a kind of a lodge there that was called the IBM Homestead, where people met and stayed, and so he created this event, this 3-day event for the 100%ers. That would be they set up like Army-style tents throughout the golf course, like thousands of Army-style tents. So all of these top-level IBM salesmen would come to Endicott, the city in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of July, where it would be hotter than hell, and stay in tents. And this was supposed to be their reward for instead of a trip to the Caribbean, this is what they got. And there was, set up a giant stage and have, hire, your musicians to play, and then speeches and awards and all this kind of thing. So it became a cultural icon, not just for IBM. Like publications like Life magazine or whatever came and did whole spreads about because it was so weird. And it was, again, one of those things that kind of imprinted in people this idea that we were in a kind of an exclusive club. And yeah, this whole thing is pretty weird, but it was just part of it, and it was a one of a kind event in corporate history.
Well, I think the weirdness is almost a feature, not a bug, in that if you kind of go through something together, it kind of bonds you, right?
Yes, exactly.
Whereas if you just, if you get a nice watch from the company, it's like, well, now I want a nicer watch next year.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Whereas if you have a real bonding experience through the raw weirdness, that's advantageous. So.
Yep.
I think that inspired a whole generation of companies to go create these incentive structures and award systems, right? Is that the origin of a lot of them?
Watson learned, so he learned a lot through his stint at National Cash Register. Yeah. And there was a 100% club. I don't think it called it something different at NCR. And so by the time Watson left, he was the VP of sales for NCR, and he stole some of the things from what he learned there, and that was one of them.
I think one of the underlying themes in all this is that Watson was a sales guy.
Yeah.
Right? He wasn't a college dropout engineer,
no.
Right? And I think that culture is very foreign to the way that we run tech companies today. But it obviously worked wonderfully.
Well, classic non-technical founder. He didn't know how these machines worked, but he knew what they could be used for, and
yes.
He knew how to sell them, and he knew how to tell the public about them, which was, and again, I sort of keep bouncing back, but I think one of the most analogous figures that we know today to what Watson was is Steve Jobs. And Steve Jobs probably couldn't have built a computer if you asked him to, but he knew what they were supposed to be, and he knew how to sell them to us, and he knew how to represent them and make us excited about them. And that's what Watson was in his day.
I just found that so fascinating, right? And I do wonder how much of that is a function of just the problems of the time, right? And that I think it'd probably be hard to go build a search engine, right, that indexes the whole web as a non-technical founder. But I think Watson's genius was introducing very large institutions like the U.S. government or the Social Security Administration to the world of technology and what it can be used for. And that's just fundamentally a very, very challenging problem for anybody. And is a go-to-market problem and a storytelling problem, and I think requires the company to be oriented in a way such that you can go through those sales cycles, right?
Yeah, and again, like Watson didn't invent anything, the original tabulating machine that became the engine of the company eventually was invented by this guy named Herman Hollerith, he was a classic technical. There was he had a company that eventually got absorbed into this computer tabulating recording company, but he was a technical founder, and he had this company that he was stayed at IBM for a long time. He was actually a thorn in Watson's side because He was such a purist about the technology. He wasn't willing to like build some of these to go after the railroad market, for instance, and things like that. And when Watson saw what all these different uses could be for the machines.
Any other elements of your time writing about Watson and digging through the archives that you thought would be noteworthy to talk about?
I'm sorry, say again?
Are there any other elements of just kind of your own journey getting inside Watson's head over the years that you'd like to talk about?
Wow, we've covered a lot.
Yeah, we have. That's why I ask. I give you the roll the dice question, right? Whatever, anything come to mind.
Yeah, I just I think my book ended up being the first modern biography of Thomas Watson Sr. And I think it's telling that after that came out, a number of other people tackled the topic in maybe in different ways. Richard Tedlow, who's a well-known professor at Harvard, wrote a book that was kind of tied the two together and wrote about the dynasty of the father and the son. There have been some other more recent books. And I think it's telling because I think in some ways Watson's been, in different moments in time, rediscovered as a figure worth studying because of the way that he built this company and this sense of thinking big, the sense of building a culture, the sense of being an opportunist during times of when bad times are here. I think one of those things that post-COVID, we're sitting here in 2024, and 2023 was a year when pretty much every startup on earth decided that to hunker down and lay off people and conserve cash, do as little as possible, and just get through this time, right? I firmly believe that if Thomas Watson Sr. were running a company and 2023 happened, he would have found a way to build up, not tear down. That's the way he thought. And I think too many founders miss that opportunity of realizing that when everybody else is down, that's the time when you can move, and you can hire the best people, and you can build and invent for the moment when things turn. Because sometimes when things turn, it's too late. And the example of that is when the Social Security Administration in 1936 decides to pass this law and suddenly needs thousands of computing machines, and there were competitors out there, Univac and others that existed at the time, but because they had hunkered down, they didn't have the ability to meet that demand right away, and IBM stepped up and said, we're ready. And that basically vaulted IBM into a leadership position for the next decade.
I think it's a very special privilege to have the cash flow of some sort of core business line to go explore and take big swings like that, right? And I would say probably a lot of the other big wins of the past 50 years, right, were kind of predicated on one basic, simple product that created a lot of cash that you could scale up and plan for years ahead.
And that's true, but it was a big, like for him at that time, that was still, the depression meant that, so
how close to the brink did he get?
To the point where it was, the board was ready to fire Watson, like just before all this happened, because they believed he was running the company into the ground. So IBM machines were always rented. That's the business model they had, right? That they didn't sell the machines to people; they leased them, and then so it made money on the leases, and it made an enormous amount of money on selling the cards, the punch cards, the classic punch cards that you probably see in a museum, and that was the version of software storage, I think, in those days, right? And only IBM punch cards worked with IBM machines, so you had to buy it from IBM. But because these were leased machines, as companies in the Depression started to close factories or go out of business or whatever, those machines were being returned to IBM. The amount of the money they were making on the leases got cut off, but so did all the money they were making on cards. So as we're going closer and closer to when the Social Security Act was passed, IBM's revenue is actually like on this downward trajectory. And yet he's still keeping every factory open and every employee employed and building up inventory, even as machines are coming back to him. And again, there's every reason to look at that and think that's crazy. But he actually firmly believed that the Depression was going to end, and when it ended, there was going to be this enormous demand, and he wanted to be the one that was ready to meet it. And he got lucky with the Social Security Act. If it had been delayed for another 2 years, maybe IBM would have collapsed. But it was, it's that sense of making a big bet.
There we go. Is that a great place to end it?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kevin.
It was fun. Thanks.
And I'll break the fourth wall here. The Maverick and his machine, available everywhere.
Yes.
20 years late, but
yeah. Thanks.
But a kind of good way to celebrate, the book, and I think appreciate kind of the enduring impact it's had on me and others. Just kind of thinking through these topics. So.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Will.
Awesome.